Welcome and welcome to a conversation, a presentation on the results from the class of 2024 college admission cycle. We're going to focus on not just what happened, but a little bit about why, and then a lot about how students and parents might adapt, respond, adjust to the realities of this year's season. Lisa and Allison and I want to welcome you. We love working with kids. We love talking about these results in a one-on-one conversation with kids. It's been a great season for the students that we've worked with, but we also know that at the end of every season, parents are often really eager to get a sense of, are there any trends? Are there any items to be aware of? And so we want to spend the next hour walking through those. Our team has worked for the last 16 years with students who have been admitted to a whole host of schools. Since our founding, 753 different schools. And what we know is that students can thrive at the schools they choose. We live in a moment where there's so much focus on the same 20 to 25 schools, and they're great. And there are so many students thriving at those. But we're going to spend a little bit of time trying to open the aperture a little bit and talk about students looking at the entire set of options. In terms of our agenda, we're going to try to step pretty quickly through these topics. We will be sharing both the recording for this webinar and the deck itself for the webinar tomorrow. And if you have questions as we go through this, please feel free to use the Q&A box. If the questions are uber detailed and specific, we may have to take a pass. If they're instead trying to clarify or better understand something, we'll definitely try to respond. Okay, college admissions trends from the class of 2024. Well, we know this, the media loves to report on trends. Two articles that are oftentimes referenced this time of the year was one by a gentleman named Jeff Salingo. Jeff does a phenomenal job of covering all things college admissions. He's got a podcast, a newsletter. He has a fair amount of inside baseball, but he has a fair amount of coverage on what just happened. And he had a great article in New York Magazine. And then in sort of a clickbait kind of a headline, the New York Times a couple of weeks ago termed this year's college admissions cycle peak college admissions insanity. I'm sure these articles got a lot of traffic. I'm not sure that they comport with the experience that the students that we worked with had. I know, Lisa, when you saw these headlines, you had your own personal reaction. I'd be curious for you to characterize what you saw in terms of how the students that we were lucky enough to work with this season, how they performed.
I think that at least with, for our sample set, I would say we did not see that this was the craziest season, I would say. I think we saw a little bit of settling, certainly not back to pre-pandemic level, but we saw students, having really great choices at the top of their list. And I think that was a function of a lot of things. One is this has been crazy now for a few years. And so I think that families and students have gotten a lot more serious about creating a college list that really matches the student's academic interests, personal interests, the family's budget. And so I think what we saw is that those really great lists that really fit the student delivered for the most part for the students because the students had done their work. So I think it's easy to get kind of in a fear mentality. And as we enter talking about trends and learning about the trends helps you be an informed consumer of colleges, right? As you enter this process, it does not need to create a lot of fear and anxiety because there's so many great options. And so tonight, what we hope to do is help you learn more about what happened, but also to talk about what are the implications of that? What can students and families do so that you feel like you have a game plan going forward?
Okay, so over the last several years, since the beginning of the pandemic, there has been this phenomenon of application inflation. Over the last 4 years, there's been a 40% increase in applications. That's reported from the Common App, the platform that is commonly used by the majority of schools in the United States. And they reported that this year, 12% increase in the number of applications to public universities, 7% increase to the number of applications to private universities, and a continued rebound in applications from international students. The Common App also noted that students' average college list size continues to grow, and the growth primarily comes from students adding more reach schools and or students who are applying to competitive majors and feel like they need a broader list, given the fact that they hope to major in computer science or business or one of the other competitive majors. Now, one of the trends that certainly has been surprising to many folks is that in a year where the SCOTUS ruling got a lot of attention, there actually have been strong increases in the number of first-year domestic applicants who identify as underrepresented minorities or first-generation students. And it's also fascinating to note that while there's a whole set of policy questions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, high school students, when asked what do they value in terms of schools for their college list, more than two-thirds of them say that diverse college campuses are a priority for them. Now, one of the other changes in applications is that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to wait lists. You see a whole host of different schools taking a waitlist strategy. Historically, Michigan has been really resolute in putting a large percentage of their out-of-state students on a waitlist and peeling off a small percentage. On the other hand, this year, there were some schools that really aggressively took students off their waitlist. And then finally, as a point of comparison for waitlist, generally speaking, the National Association of College and Admissions Counselors reported 2 years ago that the average across schools that had a wait list was a 20% acceptance rate off the wait list. Lisa, are there any indicators that you saw in terms of students and their being deferred or the use of wait lists?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is we're still seeing a lot of wait list movement. So I think we're definitely seeing more movement than we have in some of the previous years, and just a really wide range of colleges utilizing their wait list, from, you know, Ivy League schools taking students off to more mid-range schools. So I think it's an interesting, we'll have to kind of let it fully play out to know kind of where that's going to fall. But certainly, on the things that we follow, the different listservs and things, just in the last, I don't know, 2 to 3 weeks, we're seeing quite a lot of waitlist movement, and seeing that, with some of our students as well. I would say we saw this last year, but not at quite the same volume that we're seeing it this year.
Now, that growth, not surprisingly, and we mentioned this before, comes in large part at the most selective schools. As a reminder, there are only 29 schools in the United States that admit less than 10% of their applicants, and 42% admit between 11 and 20%. Now, these schools at many high schools disproportionately consume the attention and time. What we have seen is that the growth to these most selective colleges, the application growth, they've grown by almost 2 million applications over the last 3 years. Now, there are really three reasons for that. I think, mentioned test optional. So many schools continuing to have test optional policies in place. We've mentioned the fact that students and parents sometimes really have an attraction to what they think of as the name brand schools or the schools that rank highly in some organizations' ranking. And then colleges have been super aggressive in trying to make sure that students are aware of their school and marketing aggressively to those students. Now, this is just a cross section of the schools that have seen application inflation. Now, Harvard is the outlier this year. Harvard saw a slight decrease in the number of applicants. On the other hand, you can see a number of schools, as an example, Duke. You can look at schools like Georgia Tech and compare the almost 60,000 applications they got this year compared to the 37,000 applications they got in the year before the pandemic. So one of the things that we continue to see is that application inflation is sort of a vicious cycle. The more selective the school, the more attractive it is to some students. And as a result, the more students who apply to that school.
I
Now,
would point out on that slide that one of the things that you'll notice is that it is more varied, which I think is one of the kind of stories out of this season, is it that every college doesn't have the same, whereas I think in 2021 and 2022 it was just a straight line up. So we're definitely still seeing application inflation, but when you start to go college by college, you see some variance. So that, I think that's made this year a little more interesting for sure.
the academic hurdles for different schools have really remained fairly high, partially because of this growth over the last 5 years in applications. And you see it here in terms of the schools declining valedictorians, the average SAT score, the percentage of students that are in the top 10% of their high school class. At some of these schools, academics are a hurdle. A student has to clear that in order to be read. At other schools, that's a holistic component in the school's evaluation of applicants. Now, for many of these highly selective schools, early decision, the binding option to apply, is core to their strategy. The Common App indicated that 68% of students in the highest income zip codes apply early decision or one of the restricted early action options, and that on average, where schools offer an early decision option, the admit rates improve by 1.6%. Now, this really varies. You can see some of the examples here where it can be even a 3-time multiplier, or in BU's case, a substantial multiplier. But you also see that schools differ in the percentage of the class that they admit through early decision. One of the most popular options is University of Virginia. They haven't released their stats yet, but UVA is one of the rare publics that have an early decision option, but they admit relatively low percentage of their class versus via early decision. Lisa, any comments you want to make on the early decision option at these selective schools?
I think that this can become very stressful for students. So I think as students are beginning, if they're in the process, I think you can look at the number and say, 38% of students apply early decision and think, oh, I have to do this. But I think it's very important for students and families to only apply early decision or restricted early action if that is truly the student's number one choice. And I had a student this year who wrestled with this and did not do early decision, and he was so happy that he got to have his options and actually chose something that wouldn't have been in that mix, right? So that can cut either way. It's certainly a great option, but I would recommend that as students think about this, I think we're in a little bit of a peer pressure moment on this, and make sure that it is the right thing for your student, your family's budget, and that the student, I think we can get over strategizing here sometimes, and it's make sure it's the right fit school for your student. And I recommend really waiting until at least midsummer after the junior year to start really nailing that down, because as students start writing essays and becoming a part, really getting into the process, at that point, I think what they want in college becomes a lot more clear, and they're able to make a more clear-headed decision on the early decision versus if they're, I have students, in the sophomore year that are wanting to tell me, so what I've decided, which, I totally will go with that because I know they're probably going to change their mind, but, is to at that point in the summer prior to senior year, I think is when students start to have the maturity and the understanding of the college selection process often to make a better decision. That's not true for every student, but that is one of the things we've noticed.
Now, one of the things that has happened in this category of selective schools is that we've seen a dramatic increase and a real change in the schools that have become more selective. We pulled this cross section just to help parents think about schools that they might have applied to 20 or 30 years ago versus those comparable schools nowadays. So you see a Columbia that 20 years ago had an admit rate of 16%. Well, that's Georgia Tech now. You see MIT that in 2004 had an admit rate of 29%. That's the University of Texas at Austin now, and that's overall. University of Texas at Austin non-auto admit is comparable to Columbia 20 years ago. So I had a parent that I worked with the other day said, I guess I need to uninstall what I think of as different schools' level of selectivity and reinstall the current landscape of how selective some schools have become.
And when I look at that list, I think of Georgia Tech. And back when I started in consulting, Georgia Tech was about 41%. I'm aging myself here, but and I used to kind of think it was a back pocket school, and now look at 16%, definitely not a back pocket school. So it's just interesting to watch how all this has evolved. And I think it's important to kind of understand this because, as Bob said, many people understandably have to uninstall the worldview that they had on colleges because it just has changed so rapidly, which is one of the reasons that we like to do webinars like this to kind of help give another perspective.
Now, one of the things that we really like to point out is that this change is really a broad set of schools. Tulane is a classic case study of a school that has utilized early decision to drop successively year by year to an admit rate that frankly is near Ivy. Northeastern, which a parent who grew up in the Boston area related to me, I used to think of Northeastern as one kind of school. I need to now think of it as more like Tufts City Brother. It's a big competitive school. Vandy, now on par with many of the Ivies. And then there are the public Ivies. When you apply to a school like Cal or UCLA, when you apply out of state to schools like UT or Chapel Hill, you really are looking at schools that, for all intents and purposes, are public Ivies. We want to call out one of those schools just as a minor case study. UT Austin has shot up in popularity nationally. It's ranked the 10th most popular school nationally. And in Texas, if you're in the top 6% of your public high school, you're automatically admitted to the University of Texas at Austin. If you're not in that cohort, last year the admit rate was 11%. Now, UT uses a model that has become increasingly popular among many of these large public Ivies, and it's a model they call fit to major that basically says your application is read within the rubric of how well do you fit for your major of choice. Now, based on that, you can get a sense not just at UT, but at a number of other schools that the admit rate can vary dramatically by major. Champaign-Urbana, the computer science admit rate publicly announced at Champaign-Urbana is 3.7%. That is a fraction of their overall admit rate. Business, data science, nursing, engineering. Now, many schools do not release their admit rate by major, but you do see schools that are increasingly evaluating applications based on those majors. And it's frankly a response to the changes in the complexion of college majors. More than 50% of college majors in the US are concentrated in 3 areas of study. And over the last 10 years, there's been an almost 60% increase in the number of STEM degrees. Now, another trend that we saw among those public universities where we said there was significant growth is that Southern schools took their place on a national stage. So we oftentimes talk about a Vandy, a Duke, schools that really are national profile schools. But over the last 5 years, there's been a more than 40% increase in the number of applications to Southern schools. And that growth rate is much larger than schools in the Middle Atlantic and New England, where there's a large concentration of public and private schools. The public universities in the South is where the applications have skyrocketed. And in the earlier example, we talked about a University of Georgia whose admit rate last year was on par with Penn's admit rate 20 years ago. We've pulled a small section of schools. One of the ones that often gets attention is University of Tennessee, whose admit rate has gone from 75% to 33% in a 4-year window. But it's not just those large publics. You also see schools like Elon or Richmond that have also become more competitive. And as an example, Auburn, which has also seen a dramatic decline in their admit rate, that last year, 20% of Auburn's admitted class was from New York, New Jersey, or Pennsylvania. Lisa, you have seen the change in Southern schools across College MatchPoint. Is there any comment you want to add to this sort of Southern schools taking a national stage experience?
I think we are at a moment where a lot of students really want the big campus football, Greek life experience. And I think that many of these Southern colleges offer that. And as they've become more competitive, I think they have become more attractive to a wider range of students. And interestingly enough, I think they have the publics, for example, have some things in common, in terms of the way that they tend to read applicants. They're very focused on, the number of accelerated courses, whether it's APs or IB. And so they have a little bit of their own flavor, but I think at this moment for students, they're seeing that many of these schools have great majors. They offer the kind of pre-professional programs that some students are looking for. And they offer kind of that college experience that we see in a movie kind of a thing. And I think there isn't a real attraction to students for that. And so we continue to see this, and I think it surprises students a lot that how competitive some of these schools have become. If we look at an Auburn, 71% to 46, 75% to 33 with Tennessee. Also, I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, like a Tennessee, football definitely plays a part in this. So I think while many of us are hoping that students make their college decisions, on other rubrics, I think for some kids that is a really big factor. And so when a school like a Tennessee is very successful in football, that does tend to play into this. Certainly not the only thing, because we see an overall trend in the Southern colleges, but that is a factor in it as well.
Lisa, we've talked a lot about the numbers from this year's season. Can you talk a little bit about what doesn't show up in the numbers?
Absolutely. So I think when we start to think about applicants, so now we're sort of changing the channel from what the numbers said to what are factors that impact how students perform, right? And the factors that go into that, and how some of those things may have increased, changed. Certainly leadership and character have always been important to colleges. And I think there's a myth out there that the way to go at that is to see if you can run up the most service hours possible. But I think what colleges are really looking for here is they're thinking about crafting a class. And they want students who are going to be people who get involved, people who are going to be good roommates, good leaders on campus. So when we think about leadership and character, what we're really looking for students, which they can show this in many, many ways. There's not a cookie cutter way to do this, but is how do you demonstrate your ability to be a good community member, and how do you show character? And to even take that up a notch, I think we're seeing students who are able to genuinely, this is authentically, not, something contrived that the student's not interested in. But if the student has a some kind of passion or community problem that they're interested in and actually make an impact, I think we're seeing that those kind of things and the ability to reflect on those things in essays are impacting applications. The students, how much success they may have. That's a factor that's very important.
Lisa, are you saying that a student has to be president or vice president of a club at school in order to show this leadership or character?
Absolutely not. I think, and Allison could attest to this because she's such an activity nerd, is that, and an essay nerd, is that what we see is if a student can genuinely show something that they cared about, it doesn't matter if they're the president or if it's something they do quietly on their own because it related to something in their own experience or someone around them. And, one of my favorite examples was a young woman. I think she went on to UCLA, but she had a grandmother who had Alzheimer's. And so all during the pandemic, she did all these little things for a memory care facility, and made calls to the people, and so it grew out of something that was important to her. And what was really cool about it wasn't just what she did, but how she was able to reflect on that experience. And so I think those two things are kind of married together. And I'm so glad you asked that, because I think students believe that the word leadership, if you put that word in front of them, what they believe that means is that they're the student council president. And there's so many ways to show leadership in one's family, in one's community, in one's neighborhood, in one's, place of worship, many, many, many ways that someone can show leadership or character. In addition to that, I think the other piece that we continue to see, as Bob mentioned with UT, but I think we're seeing it across the board, is an authentic evidence, and I put the word authentic in here for a reason, of a student's readiness for their chosen major. So they have activities and coursework, accomplishments related to their major that are genuine. And the reason I bring that up is because we see a lot of applications, and you really can tell which things a student did because they genuinely wanted to do them, were curious, had intellectual curiosity around that, and things that are maybe a little more contrived that they weren't that interested in. But I think these activities, especially in these highly selective majors, have become more and more important. And the great thing about that, if they're done in the right spirit, is they really give kids confidence prior to going into college when they have these experiences to try things on. Even if a student, say in the 9th or 10th grade, decides, oh, I'm going to go try something related to engineering, they come back and they're like, I hated it. That's great, because now they know that before they ever went to college, and they probably know why they hated it, which then helps lead us to what they might actually like. So I think this part of fit to major activity is really critical to a college application. I also think that what we have seen with our students is it can be very helpful in helping them thrive in college and having the confidence to do that.
Two comments here. The first one is that fit to major is a very distinct philosophy. There are hundreds of schools who say to students, come to our school and we will help you discover your major, help you connect your interests and your aptitudes, and help you have an advisor and a flexible enough curriculum. The schools that tend to focus on fit to major are the larger public universities and some of the mid-size, and they frankly are schools where parents and students routinely say, the number one reason I'm going to your school is to prepare me for a great job.
Mhm.
Now, Lisa, can you talk a little bit about, in a world of test optional, the importance of a transcript?
Absolutely. I think when what we're seeing right now is, and we'll talk about this a little later, is I think we're in a little bit of a flux in the test optional world. I think there's a lot of kind of flux going on, but I think it took back that showing your rigor in high school is really critical, especially in the students' areas of intellectual interest. So this has always been true, but I think it's even more true. I think we saw a return to, making sure you've gone to the highest level of math, depending on what your college goals are, right? Choosing rigorous coursework, choosing things that are of specific interest. Potentially, I think foreign language has made a little bit of a comeback in some for some students in terms of another, thing to highlight. So I think the choices that a student makes about their coursework, which ultimately shows up on their transcript, is very, very important. And as we always say, in other webinars that we do, you can't run from your grades. The grades are the middle, they're the main thing. You cannot, like, that's somewhere that students always have to focus. Certainly when we get up into those more selective colleges, grades are here and we've got to have all the other things around them to have a successful applicant. But knowing where and when to put rigor in, I think, is a really critical part of the puzzle. And I think students who do that well, that's one of the things that helps set them apart. If you can read an application and you can kind of see the interests that flow with the interests on the resume, the activities, I think all of that starts to tell the story. Now, as I mentioned, I do think test scores are making a comeback. We're definitely seeing that in the South. We're also seeing that in some of the more selective schools. My guess is we're going to continue to see more of that. I don't think test optional will go away. I think there will be a fair amount of test optional continuing, but I do think we're at a moment where most students, the vast majority need a test score, should prep for testing, and should aim to have a strong test score, because I do think it helps students for sure. Now, I say that, but I want to say that I would say we saw both things. We saw a strong test score really help students, and we still saw students getting into some pretty selective schools without test scores. Allison had a client that was just a rock star with no test score, and really had phenomenal options. So I think that if a student has everything else and a really great transcript at a rigorous school, you can still get by without a test score. However, it's going to be easier if you have the test score. So our recommendation to our students is to focus on trying to have a strong test score and go in with your best foot forward there. Because also what we saw this year is we really had a list of, here's the schools where you're going to send the score, here may be the schools where you're not going to send the score. So, for some schools, being able to have that score is really, really important. Ideal scenario, right, is that you have a test score that you can send to all schools. That's a great spot to be in.
One comment, you can't currently get a clip art picture of a student taking an online SAT score, but SAT test. But this year, one of the biggest shifts is that the SAT went from this old bubble-in Scantron test to a fully digital adaptive test. The March test was the first taking, and students are beginning to adjust to that and adjust to a really different approach to standardized testing. ACT will follow along with their own digital offering.
Now, one other spot that we're seeing under a little bit of a spotlight that oftentimes is a factor for students is legacy admissions. We are seeing some college dropping any preference for legacy. We're seeing some, Department of Ed investigations. Right now, I would say there are some that have backed off of it, and there's quite a few that have talked about it but have not done it. And I would say our kind of internal, from our own students, we saw legacy still making a difference in a lot of places where legacy has historically made a lot of difference. So, but I do think this is going to be something to watch, because I think this is probably going to continue, and it's going to be something that will ultimately impact students and families.
I don't think you're allowed right now to have a discussion of trends and not mention AI. And this season, more than half of colleges indicated they're using AI in some part of their admissions process. It might be a chatbot to help kids apply. It might be an early review of letters of rec. 3 different surveys of high school seniors indicated that only 13% of students used AI in some fashion. I think a year and a half ago, there were a whole host of concerns that, quote unquote, the bots would write every kid's essays. And we were heartened to see kids want to tell their story. They want to make sure it's in their own voice. And as a reminder, in the Common App, you're asked to click that everything in your application is in your own words. The other thing we wanted to flag to everyone is that you're probably aware of the difficulties that have taken place with what's called the new FAFSA. And it is a fairly significant concern. As of a month ago, about 30% fewer high school students had completed their FAFSA compared to the last year. This will likely impact the fall enrollments at a whole host of schools.
So one of the things we want to do is talk about, so what can you do with all this information? What are things that are the implications of this year's results? And one of the things that we continue to see, and as a practice are huge believers in students being engaged in high school. We believe it's good for students, it's good for their development, and it impacts them down the line to have a more successful college experience. One of the things that Bob and I did, I don't know how many years ago this has been, is we made this little what we call I-4 model. And at the center of it is the student, their aptitudes and their motivations. And we're really looking at how students progress through engagement in high school. So they're going to begin with interest and involvement. And we're hoping by the time they get to junior and senior year, they're headed over into areas of initiative and impact, things that they are not just, programs that they sign up for, but something that they want to explore on their own or impact in their community on their own. And we've been so impressed with the way that students do this. And I think when we have, and some students will walk in the door in freshman year with initiative and impact as well, right? But what we notice is when students start originating, original ideas for their activity and engagement, there's typically more authenticity and more depth. And so that tends to help set students apart, especially if it's something that the student really is excited about, because by the time they start to write about it, they have a lot to say about what they did, versus if they are, we are a fan of students doing, outside programs as well. We have a huge database for that, and we think it's a great way for students to start exploring. But ultimately, as students get older, I think there is a lot of wisdom in having students, encouraging students to think outside the box on things where they might want to take their own initiative or impact. Bob, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, a couple of things. First off, this idea of engagement, it isn't Google Maps. It isn't, hey, I should do this or do this or do this, and I'll end up at Duke. A friend of mine did these three things and they got into Vandy. It instead comes from the student. And I would say, frankly, one of the reasons that Lisa and I and our team have such a passion for this has nothing to do with college admissions. It has to do with happy, healthy, motivated high school students who are prepared to thrive in the college they choose. Gallup and more recently the Walton Family Foundation did phenomenal work that pointed out sort of a simple fact. Engaged students are healthier emotionally, mentally, physically. They're more motivated during their high school years, and they're substantially more likely to thrive during their college experience. So we always say to students, don't do one thing just because it quote unquote looks good to a college. If you're driving this and if you're taking initiative and having impact in the communities that you're involved in, it really doesn't matter where you get in. What matters is that made your high school experience even more meaningful.
And one of the things I would say here is that we are seeing these kind of activities and initiatives. I would say, when I look at students who potentially overperformed in the process, and I know all three of us have had this experience, is it usually is related to this piece. I'm not just saying they had horrible grades or anything like that, but they may have gone, a half a notch, a whole notch above where we might have thought they were going to go. It almost always circles back to this.
Lisa, could you draw a distinction between what we think of as involvement versus initiative and impact?
Sure, I think that involvement is foundational, and this is developmental. I think that if we think about 9th and 10th grade, for most students, not every student, there will be some students who are already like way down the path, but it's a time of exploration. So it's setting a foundation. I think taking initiative is actually making something come into reality with a tangible outcome. And talk about something that increases a student's self-confidence, right? That will do it. The other thing that I think we see is students who maybe in their school, in their community, they leave a lasting impact. And I often ask students when we're talking about what ways they may want to get involved, how do you want this to be different when you're done? You know, that is really an important part of this. And so when you look back at the results of the that we've shared at the beginning of the presentation, and you look at these things, this is ways for students to stand out in the process and to be successful as they go forward in college. As we said, we do believe that in the current environment, students need a test plan. This is really important. We do expect that as we have more colleges becoming going back to requiring testing, we're likely going to see a dip in the median score, because what we've seen in the last couple of years is that the score has gotten so high because the lower scores have all been pulled out, right? So as we look at the results and look at what colleges, where colleges are moving forward, I think one thing that shouldn't freak students out is we're probably going to see a little bit lower scores now that a bigger pool of students are having to report scores. So I think that's an important thing to consider. The other place where we really have seen students be able to shine and again help them stand out and overperform is in being able to tell the college who you are. And one of the things that I really noticed this year, although this has always been true, is students who, you know, a lot of students will come in and say, I want to go to any Ivy League school. And I always have the same response. Well, those schools are really different. So what do you like about each one, right? Let's explore that together a little bit. And I think students who really dig in and understand the mission and the value of that college, and they can communicate that in an essay, those why essays that are really strong because the student actually knows why they're applying to the college. So they're not just applying to the college because the US News said that it's a good college. They're applying because it has this and it has this and it has this. And what that college is about resonates with them and they can write about that. That is something that really stands out. And in this, the other thing I would say is that in essays, one of the things that we continue to see colleges looking for is how well can a student actually reflect? So can they reflect on their experience? So again, another way for students to kind of stand out from the pack. And this takes time, right? To develop that. And it takes voice. I think one of the things that's sometimes scary to parents is, oh wait, but it doesn't include that they were the president of the student class or whatever. This is really the time for the student to be vulnerable. And I think much like the whole process right now, the more a student can be authentic, the better their application is going to shine. And you really can read through the ones that aren't. And so it's what Bob said, it's got to originate from the student for that to happen. And it's going to take some time. Now, one of the things that we always like to talk about at the end of our webinar is, you know, the role of a parent. You know, as we mentioned, for many parents, this landscape is so different from the landscape that many of us went through during college. And it's sometimes hard to adjust one's expectations and to kind of understand the current reality. And so I think a lot of that is really going back to those values you had for your student when they were young. Like where has your student thrived and what kind of environments? And focus on what they do, not just where they go, because this is what we have lucky job of seeing all these students, go out into the world. And, right now it's really fun because we're seeing, the kids who graduated during the pandemic are all graduating from high school. And it's so fun to see how they've thrived at so many different schools. So I think, keeping the focus there and remembering that there are so many great colleges to choose from, that doesn't mean don't look at the 25 most selective. Sure, look at them, put them on the list, but also expand out of that. And I think one of the things that we know is that parents are key partners in the college process. We always say to students, this is a family. It's you going to college, but it involves money and all sorts of things. But I do think it's really helpful to sort of try to hear your student before you tell your part of the story, so that you're getting their input, and also to connect them to resources. Many of the things required right now that help students, get experiences, whether it's an internship, research, whatever, do take some parent help. So, be willing to do that, and also encourage reflection in your home. I think that helps students so much in this process and helps students stand out in the process.
Lisa, you've seen so many families look at engagement as a family activity, not just as a to-do list for a student. Do you want to talk a little bit about this idea of engagement as a family?
We're seeing more and more families doing community impact work together, which I think is just really cool. I have a couple of students right now who go to Community First here in Austin, which is a housing complex for formerly homeless people. And it's just, I think, a great opportunity. I think that there was a time when we got so into the college process, it's just the student and kind of keep it all blocked off. And I think it is great. I think one of the things that happened after COVID is that, families were all together a lot, right? And so I think some good things came out in families from that. And so, especially for students who are more introverted or maybe not as social, thinking about, especially in those younger years, ways to do things together can be a great way to introduce your student to engagement. And then we've provided just a little bit of a guide for you in terms of high school engagement, college planning, essay and applications, because one of the things that we're really seeing in a trend among students is most students are applying to more colleges. So Bob showed that slide. Many of the students we work with are applying to 12, 15 colleges. And so this requires planning. It's not something that is something you want to leave until the last minute. So sort of having a game plan, I think, is exceptionally important in this current environment, because this can become very stressful. And one of the things I think for students that we hear is they just can get really bogged down by that, and parents also. So one of the ways to avoid that, even though we are in a very competitive environment, is to have a game plan to make sure that you slow down and think about criteria on what it is that your student is looking for in a college. Having time to do the work. I think this is another thing that people sometimes underestimate. One of the things we've seen in the last couple of years is some much more difficult essay prompts. So we have definitely seen the students struggle more with some of the essay prompts and need more time to complete that. So making sure that that summer before senior year, certainly kids should be out going to camp, doing all the things they want to do, but carving out some time, I think, is really important in as you prepare for this journey.
Lisa, we have a number of parents on the Zoom whose child is earlier in their high school career, 9th or 10th grade. What advice would you give them about helping their student to thrive?
Well, I think we've talked about engagement. I think another thing that really helps is to get your students on some college campuses early before it's, application time. So, not where you're necessarily taking the student to, oh, we've got to figure out which college is the one. Of course, take them to places that they're interested in. But I do think exposing students to colleges, having students talk to older students about their college experiences, I think is super helpful. And we often hear kids talking about that. So I think that also can be very, very helpful.